For me, it's a personal pleasure to be back in the Midwest because I spent a lot of time growing up in Toledo, just less than 100 miles from here, where my grandparents moved here after the Holocaust. So it's always nice to, and actually my grandfather worked at a Jeep factory, so for me the story of the importance of manufacturing and building things in America and in the Midwest hits particularly close to home. The premise of the book started with a very simple observation when I worked at Google, which was that war and peace aren't binary, they're a spectrum. And so two countries aren't either in a total state of war where soldiers are shooting each other or a total state of peace where it's rainbows and puppies. But there actually is an entire gray zone in between. And what became clear from the tech industry was that China's been at war with our country for a long time. And unfortunately, Vladimir Putin has been an aiding partner in the project to erode the American-led order before he decided to invade Ukraine. So I decided to write this book because I became incredibly passionate about the debate in Washington was missing a strong piece, which was that dual-use technologies are now pervasive to almost every aspect of our daily life. And unlike during the Cold War, where you had an Iron Curtain and you had proxy wars where the US and the Soviet Union fought with each other indirectly, today you often have situations where the US and China fight with each other directly, but they do it through the gray zone, and they do it in ways that are hard to define, in ways that are invisible and hard to attribute, but they're nevertheless very, very high impact. And so a lot of the book basically talks about the stakes of the war and the various parts of this conflict.
You talk in the book about the importance in competing, especially with China, but also all of our adversaries, the importance of reindustrializing America. Obviously, that hits close to home here. You heard me say before, we have the most manufacturing jobs per capita of any congressional district in the country, right here in Northeast Indiana. What do you mean by reindustrializing America?
So for a long time, the ethos in the policy world was those jobs are never coming back. And so the focus was, well, if those jobs are never coming back, we just focus on other jobs, software engineering and the new economy. And I think now we're seeing a dual paradigm where we're seeing on the one hand the consequences of not having a robust industrial base here that's capable of making the things that we need on a day-to-day basis. And at the same time, we're also seeing a lot of people raise the question, why can't some of those jobs come back? And why is it that we can't make things here? And does China possess some sort of supernatural ability to make things that nobody else possesses? Or do they have specific policies that allow them to do things that haven't been matched elsewhere? And so I think that's a very healthy debate to have. I'm not anti-trade at all. I actually am a big believer in markets. I just think that in the case where in our trading relationship with China, China possesses unique attributes that no other country possesses. They don't have a separation between their private and their public sector, and as a result, they view and treat their companies as instruments of the state. That has led them to create an entire governance regime that allows their domestic companies to have domestic monopolies at home that they subsidize, the profits of which they use to drive other companies out of business everywhere else. You see that in the solar industry, you see that in so many different industries. And so now I think we're having this new debate about reindustrialization. I think the next chapter in that debate is basically going to think through how do we divvy up the universe of products into three broad categories. The first category is, what are the products that are so essential that they absolutely have to be made here because they're important for our national security, they're important for our economy. What are the types of products that are not sensitive at all and we don't really care where they get made? And what are the products that are important but are not necessarily vital and can be made in some sort of allied space where we would trust and have confidence that they were made in places like Europe or Canada or Australia. And I think going through the intellectual exercise of thinking through which of those products fall in which category is a very healthy exercise to some extent. We're already having that debate right now with respect to semiconductors. And very quickly, we're seeing that debate metastasize to other industries, through the form of export controls and other types of products. And I think it's a healthy debate to have. And ultimately, one of the meta-level recommendations in the book, not to jump ahead, but is to the idea that we need to rethink our entire trading relationship with China holistically. Because the whole landscape today, commercially as well as politically, is just so different than when we first started opening our trading doors to them, back in the late 90s. I mean, politically, we have seen that so many of the assumptions that we made when we started trading with them have proven to, unfortunately, be false hopes. I mean, the idea that helping them become prosperous and grow middle class with liberalizing politically has not panned out. That was a theory that has worked in quite a number of places, but in the world's most populous state, it did not work, and it actually helped enrich now our most formidable adversary, the likes of which our country's never faced an adversary like this. So 1.3 billion people, incredibly technologically advanced, incredibly ruthless and ambitious, and convinced that they are an ascendant power and that we are a declining power. And I mean, ultimately, that confidence is being reflected in how they bully so many of their neighbors, which, obviously is our opportunity, because with every country they alienate, that's another opportunity for us to expand our footprint abroad.
You talk in the book a great deal about Silicon Valley. We heard Palmer Luckey talking a little bit ago about the culture. You know the culture there as well as anybody, having worked at Google and other things you've been involved with. And Silicon Valley's rejection of working with the DoD, working on national defense. How can we change that? How can we change the paradigm? I mean, we obviously need them. We're going to compete in the near term and long term, especially China and other adversaries.
Yeah, so I've seen some bigger companies have some contracts with the U.S. government, but to circle back to the point that Palmer was saying earlier, when you look at the scope and scale of the types of business engagements that a lot of the bigger companies have with the U.S. government, and when you think about how high the stakes are and the scope and scale of the threats that we face, to me, those little small projects that are being worked on, there's a massive imbalance between the business that's being done and the work that needs to be done to get us where we need to be. And so, the problem is undoubtedly I think the problem starts with culture. I think for a long time, unfortunately, there was this culture that the world was totally interconnected and borderless and global, and a lot of the time you had tech CEOs that started their pitch decks presentations with a map of the world with bright dots that are interconnected and show how information travels in an almost limitless way. And today we're actually seeing that map actually looks very different. It's a map that has political borders and has political tensions and borders that are disputed, and the world is a much more complex place. And so there has been a very slow reckoning in the tech industry of the threats that we face, and I'm encouraged that a lot of entrepreneurs are taking interest in this area. With that being said, to re-emphasize the point that Palmer made earlier, one of the big obstacles that has slowed and has fostered a lot of reluctance among the bigger tech companies in our country is the fact that over the last 20 years, they have built up a lot of commercial interests in China on both the demand side and the supply side of their bottom line. On the demand side, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them sell products in China, and so obviously, doing things that could alienate the Chinese Communist Party could cost them quite a bit of money to their bottom line. And on the supply side, a number of bigger companies, especially hardware companies, are incredibly reliant on Chinese supply chains. And to paraphrase Palmer, and this is actually an example that I can quote, Apple, unfortunately, an iconic company, and I love Apple, I have an Apple product, but they're totally reliant on China. I mean, their supply chains are, the leverage that China has over one of our biggest companies, a company that so many people have their retirement savings on, and in a way that is incredibly unhealthy and ultimately poses a macroeconomic risk to our economy. If the Chinese government tomorrow tells Apple that they can no longer make their items in China, that is over $1 trillion in savings and pension funds and American money that could potentially evaporate overnight and could really have incredibly strong macroeconomic repercussions here at home. So I think I can't stress enough how urgent it is for the government to think about some sort of reshoring strategy, even if it's not all reshored here, but if we reshore the most critical things here, and the important thing is that we get our stuff out of China, and especially in sensitive technologies.
Yeah, Northeast India is from that opportunity. In the book, you list many examples. Many of them, to me, were startling. And it's a tough book to read because you realize how far we've fallen behind and how much, how we've been manipulated by China and Russia, especially in information warfare. Can you tell us some examples of how China and Russia have manipulated information online to their advantage and to our disadvantage?
Yeah, so in a way, a lot of them, if I can answer that question with just the caveat that I define information warfare in a way that's a little bit different than is often, the term is often used in the media. Unfortunately, the media kind of uses it as a catch-all phrase to refer to basically information that anyone doesn't like. I tend to use the term foreign interference to refer specifically to the use case where you have a foreign government that uses in a concealed way a domestic entity or person here in the United States to engage in political activities on its behalf, which is also illegal under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Under American law currently, it's not legal for a foreign government for someone to be acting as a foreign agent without disclosing that relationship. And so one of the things that became clear in the tech industry is that, interestingly, for a long time, free speech was about being able to was really about access to information. And censorship was about blocking that access. One of the things that we've seen with the advent of feeds, people today consume information in the form of feeds, whether it's through Google News or Twitter or whatever your product is. And so as a result of that, censorship isn't just about blocking access to information, but it's also about downranking information. And so these autocratic governments have figured out in a very clever way that if they can fire hose these platforms with data on a specific topic, they can try to overwhelm people's feeds and swamp out the organic information of everyone else to push up their own. And so we saw these types of attempts to distort people's information environments, for example, in the beginning of the coronavirus, when China was using its various state mouthpieces to promote all kinds of rumors and conspiracy theories about coronavirus originating from the American military base, about the coronavirus actually coming from Italy, and so they do that. They use a combination of fake user accounts, misleading news outlets that are not independent news outlets, but that are wholly owned subsidiaries of the government, and to try to amplify a narrative, distort what people see on their feeds, and essentially downrank organic information about a given topic. And overwhelmingly, the reason that sometimes can work, not always, but sometimes it works, is because most internet users interact and engage with whatever content brings to the top, and very few take the time to actually scroll down their feeds to get information.
Final question, I'm going to turn it over to all of you. On page 147 in the book, you write, what makes Beijing's regime so fearsome is its weaponization of dual-use commercial and civilian technologies. Much of it conceived by unsuspecting Silicon Valley engineers. Chinese authorities use a universe of backdoor access and surveillance technology, spies, cameras, DNA swabs, smartphone scanners, vehicle trackers, and voice analysis to compile massive stockpiles of commercial and personal data. This was a big takeaway of Seth Holden's Future Defense Task Force report, was the way, especially China, is compiling all of this information, layering it, storing it, and keeping it for a wartime use application that is beyond our wildest imagination. Can you talk for a minute about that, and how can we ensure that dual-use technologies, whether coming from Silicon Valley or coming from Northeast Indiana, can be protected from our adversaries of the Chinese Communist?
Absolutely, and actually, so in the book, I describe the current Cold War between the US and China as a Great War. It's a build off of the conflict. I talk about how the Great War has two fronts. There's a software front and there's a hardware front. And the software front is the piece about information warfare that we just talked about. The hardware front is really the determining front of the war, where the outcome of the war, I think, is going to get decided. Because if you control the internet at the hardware level, you can compromise and manipulate any information that sits on top of it. And so the hardware piece is what you were referring to, the ability to basically connect information that people are storing on their cell phones, conversations that people are having through cellular connections. There is a 2012 study that showed by a Dutch telecom called KPN of Huawei that showed that Huawei actually is able to access anything that flows through its network. And the results of that study weren't actually public until a few years ago. But the reason that the Chinese Communist Party has subsidized Huawei to the tune of $75 billion isn't out of philanthropy, and it's not even out of just commercial interest. It's because they see real long-term strategic benefits to having other countries run their entire economy off of Chinese internet infrastructure. And so, stepping back a little bit, you have to ask yourself the question, what do you call a country when China is able to access all the data of all of its journalists, judges, and politicians? Is that country a sovereign country, or is it a de facto satellite state? When you have a foreign government, a foreign autocratic government that is able to pull the strings, the information strings of another country to that extent, that is tantamount to recreating 20th century style spheres of influence using 21st century technologies. And I think that's the reason why China has fought so hard against efforts led by the US government to ban and restrict the usage of companies like Huawei and ZTE.
It's a scary book, but you gotta read it, and it does give us hope at the end, a lot of recommendations for policymakers and others to take that I've taken to heart. I know Mr. Rogers and others are advocating for many of the recommendations you make in the next round of National Defense Authorization Act. So Tanner's got the microphone. I don't see any hands. While you're thinking, maybe start with that. I mean, give us more ideas of what we can do about it. I'm a member of Congress, so I can pass laws, but what can people in the room do about things?
I've been a big proponent of an advanced cities framework, which I know you and I have talked about. The idea that Currently, we have a framework that allows the U.S. government to review and restrict on grounds of national security foreign investments into the United States, particularly in areas pertaining to sensitive technologies. I think that framework should be expanded because I think every investment from China should be subject to automatically to review in the United States. But I also think that we need a framework for American money being sent to China outbound on grounds of national security. I think at this point, the fact that we have hundreds of billions of money of American funds tied up in the form of capex in China is an enormous risk to our economy, but it's also a national security risk. Just a few months ago, we've seen reports that the Chinese government has asked American companies to lobby on their behalf, and obviously the incentive being that for the reasons that Paul mentioned earlier, is that they have an enormous amount of leverage over American companies in the form of market access, but also, and perhaps more importantly, in the form of their reliance on Chinese supply chains. And that is not a situation that I think we should feel comfortable with as a country. Just like what happened with Ukraine. Russia invaded. We were very fortunate, actually, because we don't have that much trade with Russia, that we were able to put in very, very stiff sanctions on Russia, but we don't have the ability to do these types of sanctions with China. And we know that Xi Jinping has irrevocably committed himself to reunifying with Taiwan, and in his own words has said that he's willing to use force if necessary. The thought that we could potentially lose our access to semiconductors would be so perilous to our economy that I don't think we can let it happen. And if the corollary to that, the logical implication of that is that we would involve ourselves in a war with China is an incredibly scary thought. And so the two solutions that we have are, on the one hand, to deter China from invading in the first place, and on the other hand, reducing our reliance on these overseas manufacturing plants that are at risk of falling under control of the CCP.
Great presentation here. I've got a question. And I know that the Trump administration is trying to actually get us to onshore more chip manufacturing back in the United States. And many of them, like Industrial Alliance, are working very hard at that. But I wanted to move to the threat level that you spelled out, which is really scary. There are many senior voices like retired Admiral James Everest has called for us to stand up the cyber force, much as we stood up the space force to sort of compete in this environment of information warfare, cyber warfare, and so on. There's a lot of people that say, that's not necessary to get to that level. My question to you is that level of threat rise to that sort of standing up specific DoD entity, or can we take a more commercial cooperative approach like we did in World War II, as detailed by our government in Shooter's Forge, where we work very closely with the industry to confront this, or as already was discussed earlier, is the West Coast and Silicon Valley already sort of turned over and gone so far that they're not a cooperative partner with U.S. national security interests?
So before I answer that question, I also just want to add one more policy recommendation to that was actually included in the bill that Congressman Banks introduced last year. So I just want to give a shout out on a bill that I think is really good, which is that we should suspend software download applications from China, which also means banning TikTok. And I think we should have that history. India banned it, and the sky didn't fall. They banned it because they were afraid that if soldiers have Chinese applications on their phones, the CCP is able to basically pinpoint the location of enemy soldiers. I think it makes absolutely no sense to have these types of Trojan horses on our devices. To answer the question that you just raised about public-private collaboration, I'm actually a big fan of Freedom Storage. I think it's a great book. If you remember, one of the anecdotes in that book is that General Motors, during the rearmament effort of World War II, their motto was "Victory is our business." And that's the kind of patriotism that I think is really lacking in too many places today. I think one of the beauties of our system is we're a democracy and we have private enterprise, and we're not top down or centrally planned, and that's a great thing. But one of the things that we also have to deal with is that because of that, we rely on voluntary partnerships, and so therefore the onus is on the parties involved, the government, to be a friendly partner to work with, as well as for entrepreneurs to understand and appreciate the importance of working with the U.S. government. I'm encouraged that there is a whole new generation of companies out there, of venture-backed companies out there that get it and that want to work with the DoD. A lot of them are earlier stage than Anduril, so it's probably going to take a few years before they're able to ramp up production at the scale of the DoD. But it's encouraging to know that it's in the pipeline, and to echo some of the comments that were made earlier. One of the points of feedback that I get all the time talking with founders in the space is the value of death and just how incredibly difficult it is to build a profitable business model doing business with the U.S. government. And I think that if we solve that, I think that will actually go an incredibly long way in terms of doing what our country does best, which is let entrepreneurs innovate and solve problems incredibly quickly and in a nimble way, and let the government be the recipient of that and define what it is that we need. We need hypersonic weapons. Let the entrepreneurs figure out how to develop them in the most cost-effective, in the fastest way possible. In the book that you mentioned, in Freedom Storage, another anecdote that was mentioned was that during the rearmament effort, there were trainings of business people on the Amtrak to Washington. And during that time, it felt like everyone going to Washington had a contract, was going to get a contract with the Department of Defense, which is just such a world away from where we are today, considering how hard it is to get a contract with the DoD. And I think if we change that, that's sort of a very big part of the battle.
Anybody else up here?
Real quick, in something a little different, you had a comment regarding centralization, both of hardware and software, and I'm wondering if you have any observations on decentralization technology, Web 3.0, and whether blockchain plays a role in the integrity of that.
So blockchain technology is an incredibly new technology that I find kind of fascinating, and I think the intersections with national security are still kind of being uncovered. One of the under-discussed areas of blockchain technology, though, that stands out to me is that for us, a lot of the qualms that the government has with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are basically about sanctions evasion and money laundering in one form or another. And there are some concerns with the currency of the dollar, but it's really the short-term qualms are about sanctions evasion and money laundering. For us, that's an inconvenience. I mean, we don't want people to launder money, and we don't want them to evade sanctions. But fundamentally, if people do that, we can kind of live with it. I mean, our lives aren't directly going to be disrupted by it. For autocratic governments like China that rely on total centralized control, blockchain technology poses an existential threat, which is partly why they banned it. And if you see how their entire objectives in terms of why they put in place CCTV cameras everywhere, why they're trying to move people to the digital payment system, why they're using the social score, they are trying to de-anonymize the internet because they're trying to use it as a form of control. Blockchain is decentralized control and would basically prevent any kind of central authority from being able to monitor and de-anonymize, the tracking of where flows of money are being moved from one part of the network to another. And so, to answer your question, I think that there is a lot of potential in seeing how blockchain technology, if it's used in other parts of the world, can actually be used as an anti-authoritarian technology to fight authoritarians and to weaken, to take the fight to the enemy and destabilize some of these authoritarian regimes.
No.
It works.
I think the question is probably very important, yeah. Is the structure of, I've been involved with DOD 40 years plus, and on the defense side plus. I said involved with this long time. And what I'm seeing today, for the first time actually, is the greater problem we have. And it's obvious that you understand it, or you instruct this the way you have. So my question is this: could you give us a sense of Congress, if you will, and what barriers you're having to try to overcome to get everybody on board?
Now you want to get into politics.
No, I want to get a reality. I want to be I'm just amazed they don't have troops over there to take the troops.
So Lindsay in the back of the room is my deputy chief of staff. She also handles all of our defense-related work, especially related to the NDAA. So many of you in the room know her. Lindsay used to work for the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, John McCain. And when John McCain would have meetings with his staff on SAS, I'm told he would, like Chris Rose, who works for Palmer, Chris told us that he would leave the room and he would pump his fist. Every time he left a staff meeting with SAS, he would say, reform, reform, reform. Then he would leave the room. Also, the mic drop moment, leave the room. But he did it consistently. The reason I bring that up is this is about priorities, this is about attitude. And for too long, we haven't had an attitude of not just reform, but of innovation. So if I don't do this to my staff, but the modern example that John McCain, which wasn't that long ago, would be every meeting that we have in the House Armed Services Committee or SAS or anywhere to pump our fists and say innovate, 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 because that's what we desperately need now more than ever. So the future defense task force, what we learned was something I learned, and it was about fully bipartisan task force, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. We traveled the world, and we spent a lot of time with officials from the Pentagon. But what we heard repeatedly was the upside down cost, lack of incentive for the Pentagon to reward innovation, to reward investment. It's why programs like, it's why I become a big believer in the Defense Innovation Unit and what they do. And we're trying to give them more authorities, give them more resources to invest in innovation. All the branches have Naval X and AFWorks and Army Futures Command. You're seeing within the Pentagon, within the bureaucracy, you're seeing investments in innovation that haven't occurred before in bigger ways. So that's the good part. The bad part is it takes a commander-in-chief, it takes Secretary of Defense. Maybe the last one that we really had was that interested in innovation was Ash Carter. So we go back to this. He created a lot of these programs on his watch. But it really takes that attitude by the top tier of leadership to push more investment in innovation. I hope as we get nearer to 2024 that we will have a presidential contest with candidates running for president who will make the election all about how America competes with China. I hope that will be the conversation of the 2024 presidential election. I don't know if that'll happen or not, but I can tell you it's not happening with the current commander-in-chief and his team. If that sounds like a partisan comment, it's just my point of view from the seat that I sit in, that we don't have that attitude, we don't have that urgency. And it's why I think Jacob wrote the book on it. I've recommended this to every member of the cyber subcommittee that I'm the ranking member of, every member of the Armed Services Committee, all of my colleagues in Congress, who kind of pissed me off a little bit. We did the Future Defense Task Force report, put all the work into it, and then Jacob came out with the book, and it was like, why didn't we just make the book our task force? It's a lot more articulate. So, anybody else?
Yeah. You guys a good question. No, so can you comment a little bit atmosphere of capital in city ecosystems as well? Obviously, you probably have folks here potentially looking at doing funding rounds and things like that, right? So there have been steps taken to try and, do what we can to start eradicating adversarial capital, from, reaching, balance sheets and stuff like that from venture fund companies that want to be doing, business with the DoD. I think it's had mixed results, right? I think the intent is good, the rollout hasn't necessarily been effective. Can you just comment on opportunities there to continue down that pathway as well as we look to, continue the conversation with China? You wrote the book.
So just to make sure I understand your question, you're asking how companies can avoid taking money from entities that are Chinese linked, or?
Yeah, so, investors that are taking, that have a portion of their fund, right, is invested by Chinese entities or, wealthy Chinese investors and things like that, that potentially expose the companies to influence from China.
I think the best solution is for companies to vote with their feet and to ask the question and choose a fund that isn't taking money from China. I think that's I moved from San Francisco to Miami, and the impact of, in a slightly different context, a lot of people voted with their feet during the pandemic and left San Francisco, and that's had some real tangible market impact on housing and on just about every part of San Francisco's economy. And so when people vote with their feet, whether it's in the context of the city or in the context of a company, I think it does have pretty significant effects. I also think that at this point, it would make sense for the SEC to change its rules to require these types of disclosures, because right now the SEC, companies are expected to disclose material risks to their company, and a lot of companies just elect to not consider that to be a risk. But obviously, as the last 2 or 3 years have shown with the tech crackdown and everything else, it actually is a significant risk. And I would argue it's almost negligent at this point for funds not to not to disclose that as a risk, considering that a lot of the LPs and funds could actually be at risk of losing all their money, not just the returns, but the principal as well.
Representative Judy?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Our state pension funds, we have about $784 million that are exposed to Chinese companies. Senator Zay and myself introduced a bill in 2021 that essentially said if China didn't abide by certain human rights standards, that we would begin to invest our pension funds in those Chinese companies. Also, Mike Pompeo at CPAC had brought this issue up as well, as far as state pension funds being invested in those Chinese companies. Just want to get your thought on that, and as a way, on a state level, we could actually combat some of these Chinese impressions as well.
Absolutely. There are hundreds of billions of dollars a year of American money through various forms, either from private companies or different types of funds that are being invested in China. And it starts with large institutions like pension funds making the conscious decision that it's not economically sound, and it's also morally abhorrent to invest in a country that's committing genocide. And it's not economically sound in the sense that this is a country that can basically nationalize or freeze the assets of American investors on any given day of the week. And this country is filled with investors who've lost their shares in China, unfortunately.
Kudos to you, Chris and Andy, and I fully support that effort. And we've tried at the federal level to pass laws to stop our savings plan, federal pension plan for investing in adversarial companies that build up China's military industry, investing in night vision that makes cameras that they use to surveil the Uyghur Muslims, and our state pension in India invested in. That's, to me, that's unfathomable. So there are ways that we can untangle those investments and unplug your work at the state level to do it. With that, he didn't come here for you to pitch his book. He came here because he's passionate. He came here because he's passionate about this topic. But you won't regret it if you buy it and read it. It's a wake-up call, but it gives me hope at the same time that in America we have everything that it takes to compete with with China and win in the long term, and you lay out a lot of recommendations to do that. So thank you for coming forward, and we come back.
Thanks for having us.